So let's go ahead and get back to this job characteristics theory, which is once again the idea that not only do your personality traits contribute to whether or not you like a job and whether or not you're motivated by a job, but also the characteristics of the job itself. So here are the major tenets of the theory. I've already talked about skill variety, task identity, and task significance. So just as a reminder, skill variety is basically does this job require you to have a variety of different skills? Are you doing a variety of different tasks? Or are you just doing one thing over and over again? So, again, are you doing a lot of different jobs, or are you always just working in an assembly line? Putting the same cap on the same tube of toothpaste. Task identity is basically, do you create a whole finished product, or do you only contribute to a part of it? And then finally, task significance. How important this task is. Is it meaningful? Is it considered important out there? Then we also have what is called autonomy. So this is basically the sense that you have control over the kind of work that you produce and what you're actually doing in your job. Do you feel like you have that sense of independence? Or if you're working in a factory on an assembly line, do you have a lot of autonomy there? Odds are pretty good you probably don't. And then finally, are you getting feedback? So jobs can be described by these 5 different dimensions, and each of these contributes to a few different critical psychological states. So in this case, that can include meaningfulness. So task identity, skill variety, and task significance contribute to a sense of meaningfulness. Autonomy contributes to a sense of responsibility, and feedback creates a sense of knowledge. Now, each of these 3 psychological states lead to very specific personal and work outcomes. Meaningfulness and responsibility contribute to a high sense of internal motivation, and they also encourage quality performance. Responsibility and knowledge contributes to a sense of job satisfaction. You're feeling like you're learning more, you're feeling like you're progressing more, you're growing in your work. And additionally, it also creates, especially if you have a high sense of responsibility, low absenteeism and less turnover. So fewer people are quitting their jobs and you're constantly having to rehire. So what does this mean for employers? Well, this means a couple of different things. Jobs should generally make an effort to meet those 5 core dimensions. You will have better outcomes that way. Now, obviously, jobs are going to vary in how much you can be provided with this. If you're working in a factory, you're probably not going to have a lot of skill variety. So you've got to find ways to make sure that those other core dimensions are being utilized as much as possible. Now, in addition to the characteristics of the job, we also need to consider how the individual is actually going to fit in that job. And so Hackman and Oldham basically say that you have to have something called growth need strength. And that will basically moderate the relationship. So somebody may do very, very well in a job that doesn't have a lot of skill variety. I personally would not like that, but some people really would. So we have to consider how the individual fits. Something that kind of adds to this relationship is growth need strength. So if you have a need to really have a sense of purpose with your work, have a sense of meaningfulness with your work, if you value those higher order needs like self-actualization and self-esteem, that is going to affect whether or not meaningfulness and responsibility matter to you. And that will affect, again, whether or not you care that your job actually meets your needs. And one other thing that I would mention is that intrinsic motivation also plays a role as well. And this comes from work by Ryan and Deci and their work on self-determination theory. So, according to self-determination theory, if you want to increase intrinsic motivation, you have to basically provide a sense of responsibility, make the worker feel like they are competent, and things like that. Extrinsic motivation are usually external rewards or motivators, merit pay, things like that. And this potentially explains why sometimes we tend to find that oftentimes for people who are intrinsically motivated, people who like what they do, we often tend to find that giving them extrinsic motivation actually makes them like their job less. So this is what is referred to in social psychology as the overjustification effect. So if we have something that we like to do, like our job, and then we get rewarded for it in some way, what we often tend to find is that people end up liking it less because, well, they have to pay me more to get me to do it. It means I must not like it as much as I thought I did. And that's kind of the idea of how it works. So be aware that not everybody is intrinsically or extrinsically motivated. Find ways to achieve intrinsic motivation by increasing your employees' sense of competence and autonomy, and that will potentially help. Hey, why aren't you working? There we go. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the cognitive choice theories of motivation. So we're going to talk about two different theories. We're going to talk about equity theory and we're going to talk about expectancy theory. Now, what do all cognitive choice models share? All of them do consider the cognitive processes that are involved in decision making. Now, the major assumption is that we are active decision makers who strive to be rational in our choices. I'm sorry, my nose is itching. I did wash my hands as soon as I came in the door, so I hope this is okay. If you're going to touch your face, please wash your hands first. Now, obviously, if you've had my cognitive psychology class, you know that we're not always as rational as we like to think ourselves. But we are often as rational as circumstances will permit, according to Herb Simon's idea of bounded rationality. So we're going to start by talking about equity theory. And this is basically related to how fair you think conditions are at your job. This originally comes from J. Stacy Adams in 1965, who basically proposed that if you feel like your work situation is fair or unfair, that is going to play a role and affect your motivation, your attitude about your job, and the behaviors that you engage in on the job. So I want to ask you a question. Has there ever been a situation at work or at school where you felt that there was unfair treatment? And how did you respond? I'll try not to bring up too many examples, but I know there have been situations at work occasionally, and I am not specifically saying whether it's work here or not. I have had situations where I felt like I was not treated fairly at work, that bosses occasionally played favorites at work, and in those cases, it often made me wonder if what I was doing mattered. Because nobody really seemed to notice me. I didn't really necessarily get advancement that other people got. And it made me wonder, what was the point of what I was doing at all? Now, that never meant that I stopped giving it my best, but I also probably spent a lot of time feeling sorry for myself when I could have been trying harder to put up my best work. So one of the things that we find is that when situations at work feel unfair, we're a little bit less inclined to do our best or to want to do our best. So the basic idea is that we are going to compare, according to equity theory, we're going to think about what we're putting into our job, and we're thinking about the outcomes that we're getting. And we're not just doing that for ourselves. We're doing that for other people as well. So when I saw other people who were putting in as much work as I was, but were getting more recognition than I felt that I felt that that was a very unfair situation. And there was definitely a part of me that said, why bother? Odds are pretty good. Most people that have been in the workplace have felt this at one point or another in a job that they're in. So here are the main postulates of equity theory. Generally, people strive to maintain a state of equity. You want to feel like you're in a place where work is fair. Now, what does this state of equity mean? It basically means you need to feel like you're getting a perfect ratio of what you're putting in. So if you're not putting in a lot of work and you're not getting a lot back, that's a state of equity. You're not putting that much in to begin with. If you're putting in a lot and the results are also a lot, you're going to feel equity. The problem comes when we feel like we're putting in a lot and we don't really feel like we're getting what we should be getting based on what we're putting in. So this perceived inequity produces a state of tension. This is going to start to sound a lot like cognitive dissonance theory, by the way, just to kind of give you a preview. So inequity, when we feel like we're not getting recognized for all the hard work we're doing, that produces a state of tension. And you're going to be motivated to reduce this tension. Otherwise, you're going to sit there wondering, does what I do matter? And generally, the greater the perceived inequity, the greater the motivation to actually reduce that tension. And like I said, does this sound like any other theory that you've heard before? It should. It should sound like Festinger and Carlsmith's theory of cognitive dissonance. So here's how the theory works. You are constantly thinking about your inputs and your outcomes. So inputs are things that you possess that help you to do your job, your ability, your effort, your experience, your knowledge, the time you've put in. Outcomes are what you receive due to those inputs. So wages, satisfaction, recognition, opportunities, and so on. And what we basically do is we calculate whether or not we are in an equitable or an inequitable situation based on that input and output ratio. And like I said, we don't just do this for ourselves. We do this for other people as well. So for example, inequity can result when we find that we are making the same salary as our coworkers despite the fact that we have more years of education and more years of experience. This is a case where the ratio of inputs to outcomes does not match ourself and other people. The ratios are different, and that means there's an inequity. So how do we try to reduce inequity when we perceive it? I mentioned that this introduces a state of tension that we have to try to reduce in some way. So what are the different ways that we can reduce it? Well, here are a couple of different things you can do. You can change your input. So if you find that you are lacking education, you can go and get more. If you find that you have more education than most people around you, that's not necessarily going to work. Maybe it means you go and get more certification and develop better skills. But again, what happens when you have more education and more experience and other people are making more than you with less education and less experience? You can't really change the inputs in those cases. You can also change the outcomes. You could ask for a raise. You could find a different job. And you can alter your perception. Now, this latter one, you could say, well, maybe the situation's not so bad. You could maybe say, well, it's not that big of a deal. This works well over the short term, but it's not necessarily going to work well over the long term. So one of the things that we'll often tend to find with equity theory is that if you feel like the situation is inequitable, you can't really change the outcomes. Perception only works over the short term. So what we're often going to find is to reduce that state of tension, we're going to try to change that input. And I mentioned that in some cases, that might require getting more education or more experience. But what if you have the education? What if you have the experience? What if you have those necessary inputs, but things feel unfair? Well, you can't do much about your experience. You can't do too much about your education if you already have a lot of both. What you can reduce is your effort. And so one of the things that we will often tend to find with inequity is that people will reduce their effort to make their ratio of inputs to outcomes fit. So oftentimes what we will do when we feel that the situation at work is unfair is that we will work less hard. We will be less effective. We will be less efficient. So if you're paid too much, now this brings up an issue though. Usually we talk about inequity when somebody's being paid too little relative to their education and experience. But what if you're paid too much? What if you're making far more than you deserve? What should you do then? Well, according to equity theory, you should either change the inputs or you change the outcomes, which means you should either work harder or you should ask your boss to reduce your pay. And I'm laughing because generally most people don't do this. Now, this doesn't really work well for equity theory when the inequity is basically that you're paid too much for what you do. Most people will not necessarily work harder if they're paid too much for what they do. And most people generally will not say, hey, sir, you're paying me way too much. You need to cut my salary by about 25%. That's not going to happen. But what's interesting is that despite the fact that most people don't do this, one of the things that we do find is regardless of whether you are being paid too much or paid too little, whether you're getting more recognition than you deserve or not enough recognition for what you deserve, inequity in either direction actually leads to burnout. And equity theory is really important because it is the foundation for the notion of organizational justice, which focuses upon workplace fairness in terms of the procedures that are undertaken and also in terms of things like pay. So we have both distributive justice, which is concerned with outcomes, so things like pay, recognition, annual review, stuff like that. And we have procedural justice, making sure that there's fairness in hiring, selection, promotion, demotion, and so on. Next, we're going to talk about Vroom's expectancy theory that was proposed in 1964 that includes a model called VI. The main assumption of expectancy theory is that behaviors result from a conscious, deliberate, cognitive choice from multiple alternatives or multiple options. Generally, what we are going to do when we are trying to figure out what choice to take, and by the way, this theory is making the assumption that we are totally rational with this, that we are evaluating it in terms of its valence. Is it positive or is it negative? Instrumentality and expectancy. Like I said, it's assuming that individuals are rational. So we call it VI because of valence, instrumentality, and expectancy. So what is expectancy? Expectancy is the likelihood of us actually meeting our goals while we are exerting effort. So for example, will studying for 3 hours result in an A on the next exam? Or, in the case of the workplace, will working 60 hours per week result in a good performance review? So basically, will you be able to meet your goals if effort is exerted? Do you have a good feeling that good things will happen as a result? What is instrumentality? Instrumentality is the relationship between actually doing that behavior and the likelihood of a certain resulting outcome. So will getting an A lead to other good outcomes? So if I get an A on a test, will that lead to a greater likelihood of an A in the class? Will a good performance review lead to other good outcomes like a raise or promotion? And what's valence? Valence is how satisfied we'll be from the outcome. And generally, if we'll be satisfied by it, if we like it, that's what we'd call a positive valence. So that can happen in one of two ways. We can either have an intrinsic or an extrinsic motivation. So we can have an intrinsic motivation. Getting an A will be valued to the extent that it makes one feel like something's accomplished. Or we can have extrinsic. Getting an A will be valued to the extent that it is perceived to lead to other good outcomes. In work, a good performance review will be valued to the extent that it makes one feel like one has performed well, or a good performance review will be valued to the extent that it's perceived to lead to other good outcomes. So each of these plays a role in what kind of choices we make and what kind of motivation that we have. So outcomes are more likely to be valued if other good outcomes stem from it. So some of us are very intrinsically motivated, but most of us, at least according to Vroom, are operating under this extrinsic motivation. So put V, I, and E together, and your beliefs about these three factors will interact to create motivation. So this force will prod us to act in ways that make us feel pleased and will help us avoid behaviors that lead to disappointment. So here's what's really critical about all of this. What we find is that if this is a multiplicative function, so they have to multiply. If valence, instrumentality, or expectancy is 0, no motivation at all.